There's a saying, knock on wood. It's time to reconvene, and if we could reassemble, we'll let things continue. That works pretty good for you. That works pretty good for you.
Yeah, it does, it does.
Yeah. Okay, well, when you're ready to start, I was just thinking there's another break. You did 3 topics, there are 7.
Yeah,
And the way the break looks, we'll do the Civil War.
all right, I think we're ready to tackle the subject of church leadership in the River Church in that period. And just a preliminary observation before I read. Something happened here in the River Church different from the other Somerset County churches. You have the Berlin Church evaporating, disintegrating. And you have the Johnstown or the Conemaugh Church becoming pretty well integrated with the Mennonite Church without leaving any Amish church in that area. Where here, as it turns out, there was a continued authentic Amish church, and it's still today in this area. And I have an idea that leadership had a lot to do with this. If nothing else, at least the presence of leadership is something that was very well taken care of. The historical Amish concept of a fully staffed pastoral team called for a bishop, 2 or more ministers, and a deacon. It appears that the river congregation was well supplied with ministers and bishops during this 3rd quarter of the 19th century. There may have been a gap of a few years in supplying the office of deacon. I have identified 8 men who served during all or part of this quarter century. I have not found anywhere a list of who these ministers were during this period, so I set about to try to make one, and this is what I've come up with: 8 men. Yost H. Yoder, Jonas Beachy, John C. Nagy, Jacob Brenneman, Daniel Hirschberger, Joseph J. Schwarzendruber, and Joel Beachy. In each case, I found the death date, but I did not find how active they were to the end of life. I shall share a few notes on those known to have been ministering then and there. Yost H. Yoder lived near Summit Mills, where he was an early pioneer. Date of ordination is not known. The 1850 U.S. Census shows Yost at age 66 and his wife Elizabeth living in Elk Lick Township. He attended a ministers' meeting on October 3, 1830. He may have served in the ministry during the entire 2nd quarter, 1825 to 50. He served much of the 3rd quarter. He died in 1871 after 21 years as a minister in the period of this study. Jonas Beachy married Sarah Nagy. During many of their adult years, they lived near Springs along present-day River Road. Later, they moved to Kaiser's Ridge, to the farm located on the southeast corner of I-68 and US 219. They were the parents of 12 children. Jonah succeeded Benedict Miller as bishop of the River Congregation. He may have been ordained as minister before Benedict died in 1837. The dates of his ordination as minister and as bishop are not known. He was serving as bishop at least by 1843, when he officiated the wedding of Veronica Hirschberger and Benjamin Beachy. Jonah's tenure as bishop extended to the entire period of this study. Jonas and Sarah are buried on their Kaiser's Ridge farm. The cemetery is visible on the east I-68 ramp from US 219. You come down that ramp, you look down, oh, if the brush isn't growing up too much, you can see that family cemetery down below. John C. Nagy is designated as a minister in the genealogies. He lived in Elk Lick Township in 1850. He was then 36 years of age with a family of 6 young children. The children born before 1853 are recorded as born in Somerset County. His obituary records his death in Indiana in 1889 and his ordination about 52 years earlier, before his death, in Somerset County. This places John's ordination back to 1837, when he was 21 years old. How long did John C. Nagy serve the River Congregation in the period of this study? Evidently 1 or 2 or 3 years before he moved away. Jacob Brenneman is known as a minister in family lore and is so designated in the genealogies. Jacob arrived from Germany with his parents in 1826 at 19 years of age. He married Catherine Ingle, whose father, John Ingle, was a farmer and a millwright and active in the Reformed Church. The date of Jacob's ordination is not known. At the beginning of the period of this study, he was 44 years of age. He likely was called to the ministry by then or very soon thereafter. Jacob and Catherine lived in the New Germany area early in their married life. In 1856, they bought a farm near Bittinger, Maryland, on Frank Brenneman Road. The house built there by Jacob stands yet today. Their home was a frequent stopping-off place for travelers going between Grantsville and the Forks and Gortner. Daniel Hirschberger is listed as a minister in the genealogies. The date of ordination is not known. In 1850, Daniel was 43 years of age and may have been ordained by then. Daniel and his wife Sarah Nee Nagy lived at Narveton on the farm later known as the Lewis S. Yoder Farm, later owned by Clarence L. Yoder, then Simon C. Yoder, and now a son of Simon C. Yoder, whose name I don't have right here. Some of you might know who that is. They were the parents of 11 children. The 1850 census shows them with a household of 5 young children plus a maid. Daniel must have learned adult responsibility early. When he was age 20, in 1827, his father Peter was killed by a falling branch when traveling on present-day Ash Hill Road. Daniel then became the main hand on the family farm of 187 acres. His obituary states that he ceased was a faithful minister in the Amish Mennonite church until he was called from labor to reward. Daniel and Sarah are buried in the family cemetery on their farm. Joel Beachy joined the ministerial team early in this period. He was ordained a deacon in 1851, a minister in 1853, and a bishop in 1854. He and his wife Elizabeth Nee Nagy had 4 children who grew to adulthood. The record is not clear on others who died young. In 1850, their household included 2 small children and 2 additional persons, apparently a maid and a hired man. In 1870, 2 daughters were in the home, aged 20 and 17, and a 3-year-old boy named Blocker. Jules' 40 years as bishop included his first 24 years as co-bishop with Jonas Beachy and 19 years beyond the period of this study. This couple lived on Dorsey Hotel Road, about 1 mile north of Grantsville, or 1/2 mile from here, just over this way. They lived there from 1843 till death. They are buried in the family cemetery on the farm. Joseph J. Schwarzendruber was ordained as deacon in 1853, apparently to succeed Deacon Joel Beachy when he was ordained as minister that year. Joseph moved to Iowa in 1856. Earlier, Joseph had gone to Iowa as a single man, became ill and discouraged, and returned to Maryland. His marriage to Barbara Brenneman included a stipulation that Barbara and he remain in Maryland during Barbara's mother's lifetime. After her death, Joseph and Barbara moved to Iowa, where he was then ordained as minister and later as bishop. It is not clear how the church responded to the vacancy of the deacon's office when Joseph left the Casselman Valley. Elias Hirschberger is recognized in genealogies and other sources as a deacon. I have not succeeded in finding the date of Elias's call to the office of deacon. He is not included in a list of ordinations by Joel Beachy, beginning with 1863. Was he ordained before 1863 by Jonas Beachy, or less than 27 at less than 27 years of age, or right after Joseph Schwarzendruber moved to Iowa when Elias was age 20? The Nagy genealogy, published in 1897, tells us that he had served many years. Elias and his wife Elizabeth lived near Niverton on the farm that borders the old order Amish meeting house. They had 13 children, of whom 8 grew to adulthood, 5 died young, and are buried in the cemetery on the farm. Elias and Elizabeth are buried in the Oakdale Cemetery near Salisbury, Pennsylvania. And that brings us to the end of the reading on church leadership. What else do you know? And we've got a good set of ears up here now, so be free to talk. But one conclusion I've come to is the church was quick in providing leadership. There were some that moved on west and so on, but they were quick to provide leadership. And I think they wanted that full staff of a bishop. And much of the time during this period, they had 2 bishops actually who were active. And you can imagine that wide geographical spread along the river and the way travel was in those days, that it could have been difficult for one bishop to keep up with all the weddings and all the funerals and all that goes with the bishop responsibility.
I had a question on Amish. My understanding, there were a lot of Amish in Berlin area at one time. Berlin, Pennsylvania. They have beautiful farms over there. And why aren't there any Amish there today?
I've heard that question asked at times when my father was asked that question, and I heard my grandfather, J.B. Miller, talk about the problem of that church. And I believe that one major thing that happened, there was a great deal of emigration from there west, but I don't know if it was more so than here. I know one comment was that they had become too gutlos. They had become too ungodly and indifferent in a lot of ways. And I have the impression, I have not studied this closely, I don't think they had this kind of church leadership in place in those years. And the last minister, at least the last bishop, to have been there was Abner Yoder, who then moved to Kelowna, Iowa. Maybe he was not a bishop, maybe he was ordained bishop there. I think he was the last minister. And there's one historian who once told my father that he remembers having gone with somebody to visit his grandmother there in the Berlin area, and there were a lot of benches stacked on the back porch. And she said that those were left there after the last Amish church service there. That doesn't explain why. But I think it's a combination of things going on, sort of an apathy must have set in. And whatever you think of the Amish style or approach of leadership, there was a leadership in this place, in this area here, that I think was somewhat lacking, especially at Berlin. That's the best answer I can give.
Let's see, I just want to say I really appreciate these meetings, very informative, and one of the things, this is more of a general question, just out of sort of a curiosity, no reflections, but you mentioned that in the early days, the German Baptists were very active, and a lot of the Amish would have gone to the German Baptist Church. And I was curious about the presence of that church, or the maybe Church of the Brethren now in this area. Is it very active and populous? And also another question, sort of a general question, is I'm curious, as a percentage of the population here in the general area, what percent would be Amish or Mennonite?
Yeah, two questions.
All right.
The first one, a lot of people went to the German Baptists, and do you know anything about the current state of the German Baptist Church here?
Yeah. I don't believe I'm qualified to answer on the current state of the German Baptist Church. They have the churches here in Garrett County, some smaller churches, and there's a very used to be at least a large church building in Myersdale, and someone has said, there's some historian, I heard my father say this, claimed that this was one of the strongest areas for the German Baptists back in that period in Somerset County. Berlin was very strong with German Baptists also, as well as coming over and finally spilling over into Maryland here. And I'm not sure about what is known as the Old Order branch. Back in the 1880s, there's a three-way split that they experienced. That would be just beyond the period that we're talking about here. And what formed then was Brethren Church and Church of the Brethren, and German Baptist, I guess, is a name retained by the others, who were quite, you might think of them as the Old Order branch of the Brethren. At that time, I believe which was a more progressive one, I think Brethren Church was a more progressive. They might have headquarters at Ashland, Ohio. and the Church of the Brethren, headquarters at Elgin, Illinois. And those two branches were, the split happened right here also, especially over at Berlin. But I'm not really qualified to comment on the current state of the Brethren here.
Can you repeat your second question? My mind didn't keep it.
I was just interested, right here in the local area, about what percent would be Mennonite or Amish as compared with the general population?
During that time period?
Today.
Currently? Do you know what percentage of the current population in this area is currently Mennonite or Amish?
No, I do not. I would not want to try to guess on that one.
What were the duties of bishops, ministers, and deacons, and how were they selected? Were they really through a lottery?
So what were the job descriptions for the deacons and bishops and ministers?
I would like to answer that question by reading to you the charge given at a bishop ordination and the charge at a minister and the charge for deacon. Those are available as they were copied but I did not go into that in this presentation. But basically, the bishop had a major responsibility and still would in Amish circles and in some Mennonite circles. A major responsibility for the welfare of the church, the disciplines of the church, whatever the disciplines and the expectations are in lifestyle, to see that those are seen after. And he then would share the pulpit in turn with the others, but would not necessarily preach more often. And I'm partly leaning back on my own experience right here at Maple Glen growing up, where we had a bishop and we had a few ministers and we had a deacon. And what I understand is still prevailing in the Amish churches today. The minister was there to preach the word. That was the emphasis as a major responsibility, and yet there was a team at work. And it was almost like if you ordained a bishop, you were a bishop forever and wherever you went. And in the Conservative Mennonite Conference, for example, in the earlier years, there were only some things that a bishop would take care of. And it didn't matter where you went, though, you were a bishop wherever you went, and you had some of those responsibilities. A bishop could officiate at baptism, at weddings, at communion. Only bishops did those jobs, not ministers. But ministers preached the word and formed they didn't call it a board, but sort of a board of committees, what it essentially was. The deacon, it varied quite often, whether or not often there's a controversy of whether a deacon should preach or not. And we did not, often a deacon was not assigned to preach, but he was assigned to read the scripture at a certain part of this, and that is part of the charge given to the deacon, to read the scripture. And he was also the one who was to mediate and to deal with people who were deviant. What's the word I want? Deviating from the norms, to deal with those situations. I found a letter in my grandfather's papers where Bishop Joel J. Miller wrote a letter to Deacon John Brenneman in the Forks. I think there's some Orndorffs were misbehaving a little up there, and he wanted them to go see after that matter. I think they were riding bicycles and lost their hats and doing things like that. And Joel J. Let's do what we need to have peace in the church. And so that was a deacon's job. And he took care of the money also, the alms fund, and so on. So that's just sort of a rambling job description.
And could you describe the selection process?
The selection process was one of the use of the lot was involved, and it would start with the congregation without nominations giving a vote. They referred to it as giving your voice, the Stimme, to give your voice, and for some man from the congregation that you would nominate in that way to be minister or whatever the office was being called for. And then out of those votes, any man who had 3 or more votes, and sometimes it was done 2 or more votes, but I think more typically 3 or more votes, was placed into the lot. And that means that each of them, so far as human thinking goes, each had equal chance to be chosen to be minister. But if you believed in that process, you accepted it as God's divine work to make God's own selection out of those in the lot to select one. And so when that was established, there was a process that varied from place to place, a process of examination for fitness. And then when it came to the ordination service, if there were 3 men in the lot, for example, there were 3 books prepared, 3 identical books, and then they were placed on a shelf or a table. And when the time came, each man would choose a book. But before they do that, there was a slip placed into one book. I remember one occasion here at Maple Glen where the bishop in charge told one person to take those books out into this anteroom right here and lay them there and shuffle them. He came back in, then he sent another one out to shuffle the books again. He sent a man out to place the slip into one of the books, came back in, sent another man out to shuffle the books again, and came back in, sent another one to bring the books out, laid out the 3 books, and then each man was to select a book, not knowing where the lot is unless it was revealed to him divinely. And wherever the bishop in charge then would start at one end of the row and look for the slip in the first book. If he didn't find it, went to the next until he found the book. And typically the bishop would say, "The Lord has called you to preach the gospel." So that is the way the lot worked. Whatever you think of it, I want to say this, that it was a method that enabled this Amish church back in this period to supply itself with ministers. They didn't go to the process of a search committee, for example, and of hunting and that method. And I know when my father was ordained, I was 5 years old, and they went to church on a Sunday morning, and the whole thing was taken care of in one Sunday morning service. And I remember sitting in they had benches up here in the Amen corner, and I guess I was then given over it. When my dad's name came up, I was sitting with an uncle, I think, and sitting right behind my dad. I couldn't figure out what they're doing to him. He's 5 years old. His neck was all red. And so then we went home, and the crowd was there to sympathize for the Sunday noon meal, and it was we almost couldn't get parked even with our family car. We were later in getting there, and I still didn't know what happened that morning, and so walked into the lawn, and then my cousin Catherine Moss came to me and said, "Bist du froh, dass dein Papa ein Prediger ist? Are you glad that your father's a preacher?" Then I understood what happened. Well, that's a little more history than you asked for. Sorry. Well, shall we move on to the next one, or is there something else yet?
How was the laity involved in policy, church policy?
The question is, how was laity involved in church policy?
There is this thing called the Atnung, or the Church Council. And Curtis can help me out if I don't get it said right. But typically there is, as I understand it, often might be a proposal brought by the ministerial body. That body of bishop, ministers, and deacon, that was the leadership team. And they might bring some proposal, or there might be some question up, and then the counsel of the church would be taken. And I wonder if it's done this way in the Amish church today, but I remember from Maple Glen here in my boyhood days, the ministers then would go back through the congregation and get the response of each member. Non-members were dismissed, only members present for these decisions, and get the response of each one. I recall a rather common response would have been, "Ich hab kein Aufenthalt." I have no objection. But sometimes just a nod of approval. But if somebody had an objection or wanted to register it, that could be done also. Sometimes there's an emphasis on all decisions needing to be unanimous, but very often it wasn't totally unanimous then. Does that register?
That's exactly how we would do it now.
Exactly how you do it now. And that demonstrates that our church here was the conservative Amish Mennonite congregation. In my boyhood days, we had the same pattern as the Order Church did, and as has today yet, I believe. Well, I guess I got a little long-winded here, sorry. Shall we go on to Doctrine? This is a short one. I've abbreviated this one. Much more could be said.
I do have a quick question. At this period, was the order of the church service the same as today in the old order church? The anfang, the prayer, Bible reading, and then the main sermon, and then the Zeugnis?
He's listing the order of the church service, the beginning, translate.
Yeah.
Is it the same as it is today in the Amish?
Let me try and see if what kind of a Zeugnis that Brother Duff, first name escapes me right now, Curtis has for this. We had Sunday school first, and then the Sunday school would be closed by the superintendent. Then we would sing, I think it was 2 songs, and then there would be the anfang, like a short, either call it a short sermon or an extended devotional, and then this was followed by a kneeling prayer. Was that prayer a silent prayer? I think. I'm not sure now, but we had a kneeling prayer, and I think that was a silent prayer. And how did we know when the prayers finished? The preachers were sitting up here, and when you hear the feet shuffle, you knew it's time to get off your knees now and be seated again for what is next. Following that was a reading of Scripture by the deacon. And after that reading of the Scripture was the main sermon. When I was a small boy, I thought those were very long, but the main sermon followed. And then after the main sermon was a that was a kneeling prayer. That was a kneeling prayer. And but audibly prayed by the minister had the sermon, they'd kneel here typically and face the congregation. And some of those prayers were wonderful prayers. I would like to have recordings of them. Excuse me, my memory got a little too sharp. Dismissal, there was a time when we would stand for dismissal, I think, and then a song, I can't remember for sure. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, okay. Well, let's go on with the Doctrine one. This is a short one. The Dordrecht Confession was written in 1632 in Holland. In 1660, it was adopted also by a group of Swiss Anabaptists who later identified with Jacob Ammon in the Ammon-Rice division of the 1690s. The Amish immigrants brought the Dordrecht Confession from Europe to America. Dordrecht was the primary expression of the doctrines of the Amish Church of the Casselman Valley. It has continued as a standard of the Old Order Amish. The Dordrecht Confession is evangelical in its treatment of man, sin, and salvation. It is Anabaptist in its doctrine of the church as a called-out people, in contrast to the territorial church of Catholicism and the Reformers. The doctrine of non-resistance, early expressed in Anabaptist teaching in Schleitheim of 1527, is an important part of the confession. Alongside Dordrecht, the ministerial leadership of the River Church retained the rituals and forms used in earlier times. They apparently were not highly interested in new materials to enhance their ministry. Joel Beachy, in his later years, copied by hand documents of the previous generation. He copied the Discipline of 1837. He copied lists of scripture references of the church calendar. He copied forms for weddings, baptisms, confessions of errant members, excommunication, and for receiving penitence back into fellowship. Some copies of these items show wear of folding and unfolding. The Amish immigrants brought with them from Europe a background of written and unwritten disciplines. They attended to such matters also in America. I'm sorry, I overshot here a little. Let me retrace a little to bring us back to where we want to be, where I read about Joel Beachy having made these copies. And they show wear, as though they were carried in a pocket, folded in pocket, and used on appropriate occasions. And Joel's seriousness about these documents testifies to his interest in preserving values of the past. He often ended his copying with these words, abgeschrieben von mir, Joel Beachy. Copied by me, Joel Beachy. Well, that's all I had planned to share on the subject of doctrine. The next subject is on disciplines and practices. I separated the more basic doctrine of the Dordrecht from the disciplines and practices of the period. Anything before we go on with the disciplines and practices? On disciplines and practices, the Amish immigrants brought with them from Europe a background of written and unwritten disciplines. They attended to such matters also in America. A meeting of Amish ministers in 1809 resulted in a position paper on various points of practice. This was a national meeting, but at a time when the American Amish were located almost entirely in Pennsylvania. We discussed this paper in our study of 800 to 1825. A meeting of Amish ministers of 1837 dealt with various issues. This was a meeting of the three Somerset County congregations, Conemaugh at Johnstown, Glades at Berlin, and the River. We discussed that position paper in our study of 1825 to 1850. An atmosphere of unity seems to have occurred in the meetings of 1809 and 1837, but after 1850, differences developed among the Amish in America. Many immigrants of the second wave arrived in Baltimore from 1825 to 1850. They followed the National Pike west to Grantsville, but many did not settle in western Maryland, but went farther west. Some went to newer settlements such as Butler County, Ohio, and northern Illinois, including Tazewell County. Additionally, many of the second wave did not land in Baltimore, but in New York, and some in Philadelphia. From there, they found their way west. Some were less concerned about the expectation of the Eastern Amish. Their style of dress was less distinct. In one case, a group brought along musical instruments. These differences became acute nationwide after 1850. Bishops Joseph Goldsmith and Jacob Schwarzendruber, both of Iowa, exemplified the differences. Joseph Goldsmith was an immigrant from Alsace, France. He arrived in Philadelphia and went to Ontario in 1819, then to Butler County, Ohio in 1831, where he was ordained bishop, then to Iowa in 1846, first to Lee County, then to Henry County. Jacob Schwarzendruber was an immigrant from Waldeck, Germany. He arrived in Baltimore in 1833 and settled in the Glades in 1840. He moved to Grantsville in 1840 and to Johnson County, Iowa in 1851. In the absence of an Amish bishop in Johnson County, Goldsmith officiated a communion service there in 1852. In 1853, Goldsmith ordained Schwarzendruber as bishop. 15 years later, in 1868, Jacob Schwarzendruber expressed some of his concerns for the church, including a fear that working together with Joseph Goldsmith and his co-workers will not be possible without bad results in the church. This difference between a leader concerned about the old order and one who was more open to change typifies the rift that occurred in the larger Amish church. An attempt was made to mend the rift. A series of annual Amish conferences was launched. These conferences occurred from 1861 to 1878, except 1877. The first conference was held in Holmes County, Ohio, the last in Eureka, Illinois. These meetings were intended for all Amish ministers in the country, but many of the more conservative-minded ministers did not attend. They saw the meetings as led by change-minded ministers. However, Bishop Joel Beachy and Minister Daniel Hirschberger of the River Congregation did attend in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania in 1863, and again in Ohio in 1865. The annual Amish Conference of 1865 convened on June 5 in Wayne County, Ohio. It was known as the Allgemeine Dienerversammlung, General Ministers Meeting. Attendance was at a record high, partly because more conservatively minded Amish ministers attended at the urging of the planners. Joel Beachy and Daniel Hirschberger were there. But just ahead of the June 5 meeting in Wayne County, another meeting convened on June 1 in nearby Holmes County. 34 conservatively minded Amish ministers met to discuss and write their own position paper before going to the larger meeting in Wayne County. Joel Beachy and Daniel Hirschberger were among those who went from Holmes to Wayne. The paper developed in Holmes County on June 1 included items of prohibition, attendance at worldly conventions, attendance at worldly conventions and fairs, property insurance, lightning rods, gaily colored or shekich clothing, worldly parting of the hair by men and women, worldly cutting of the beard, pictures of human likeness, overcoats of rubber and oilcloth, worldly merchandising. The June paper also included points of church practice, singing spiritual songs and tunes, not notes or fast tunes. Only members to be in the church council meetings. I told you how at Maple Glen there, non-members were dismissed when there's a members meeting. Members to meet at the beginning of the church services. The paper of June 1 also stated principles related to the prohibitions and expectations. They listed not only what, but why. They believed their positions were valid because of things that lead to pride and display and lead away from God and are harmful to the church. Church services should be conducted, quote, as our forefathers did. They believe the positions taken in the paper are right and good in accordance with the word of the Lord and our confession of faith, that's Dortrecht, and as we have been instructed and taught by our forefathers. These 34 Amish ministers tied the keeping of the Amish discipline to the baptismal vow. They wrote, "We intend to stay by the same as we promised when we were received into the church by baptism." With them, it was more than a matter of preference, but a matter of conscience. Joel Beachy and Daniel Hirschberger signed the conclusions of that meeting of June 1 with its items of prohibition, items of expectation, and reasons behind the positions. 4 days later, most or all of the 34 ministers were in the Amish General Conference in Wayne County, June 5. There they presented their position paper of June 1. The response of the General Conference to the paper of the more conservative Amish ministers is described by historian Peyton Yoder, quoting Peyton. It was concluded, evidently with little or no discussion, that the paper need not be acted upon, since the concerns presented therein had already been covered by a ruling made earlier in the conference. But Peyton Yoder comments further. This assertion was only partly true. The earlier ruling of the conference had dealt entirely with the matter of personal adornment, whereas a Holmes County position paper covered a multitude of concerns. As Joel Beachy and Daniel Hirschberger returned from Holmes County, Ohio, in June 1865, they must have felt keenly that the nationwide Amish split had crystallized. No longer would preachers be interchanged among some Amish churches. No longer would the kiss of peace, the kiss of brotherly love be practiced between some Amish people. Although Joel and Daniel may not have sensed it in 1865, there would be new nomenclature. Old order would become a proper noun for some. Amish Mennonite would be applied officially and specifically to the churches represented by the majority of the meeting in Wayne County. But Joel and Daniel could rejoice that the split was not local in the Casselman River congregation. We have an expression of unity in a document of 1887. Joel Beachy wrote a letter about the ban and shunning of excommunicated church members. The letter bore the signatures of endorsement of the ministers of the river congregations, that is, both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. The signers were Joel Beachy, Manasseh Beachy, Elias A. Yoder, John Brenneman, Jacob S. Miller, Moses D. Yoder, Joel J. Miller, Christian S. Beachy, and Elias Hirschberger. Here apparently was a unified ministerial body, not drawn apart by the division that had occurred in many other Amish communities. So here we can have open discussion again. Before I go into another aspect of, you might call discipline, the distilleries, I have a few words to say about what was happening with the distilleries in the period. So what are your comments, your questions, your observations on the disciplines?
I know it's time for break, and we'll do an abbreviated break and then continue. Let's just stand, and Bernard, would you arrange for the offering that's called for at this point? So let's stay in place, stand and stretch a little bit. And David, your next topic is on the Civil War, or?
If we have time, I'll have a section on distilleries
Okay.
to be followed by the Civil War.
And Bernard's arranging for the offering at this point. The people in charge of the budget said, can you remind the people to be generous in their giving? Last year there was a close call, so we're having lunch in an hour from now, so if you will just remember that.